I trusted you more than anyone, I said, my voice steady, but my knuckles white on the workbench. The words hung there, heavier than the oil-stained air of the shop. The only sound was the slow drip of water from the old AC unit in the corner. Faith stood in the doorway, arms crossed tight, her weight shifting from foot to foot like she wanted to run, but knew it wouldn't do her any good. She didn't answer. She just stared, wide-eyed, like a deer caught in the high beams. I wiped my hands on a rag, more out of habit than anything, and tossed it onto the workbench. "How long?" I asked. No yelling, no theatrics. Just business. Her mouth opened, then closed. A swallow. A glance at the ground. Abel, how long? The words came out like a sigh. "A few months." I nodded, jaw tight. "A few months. Long enough." "Lawson." I didn't need to ask, but I wanted to hear her say it. Her eyes darted up to mine, searching for something. Maybe a way out, maybe a way to soften the landing. But I wasn't giving her one. "Yes." I let out a slow breath, rubbing the bridge of my nose. The tension in my chest wasn't anger, not the hot kind, at least. This was colder, heavier, like a weight settling in, solid and immovable. I'd seen betrayal before, back when I was running with the Iron Spiders, back when trust was the difference between walking out of a deal or getting left in a ditch. I just never thought I'd see it in my own home. I turned away from her, looking out past the shop doors. The late afternoon sun cut long shadows across the cracked pavement. My guys had already cleared out for the day. Only Tom was still around, tightening something under the hood of a Ford that should have been scrapped 5 years ago. Good man. Didn't ask questions unless you wanted him to. Faith shifted again, her sneakers scuffing against the floor. "Abel, I didn't mean." I held up a hand. "Don't." A pause. Then, softer, "I didn't want to hurt you." I almost laughed. "Almost." "Yeah." I turned back to her, shaking my head. "You think that matters? You think I give a damn about your intentions?" She looked away. No comeback. I leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. "So what now? You planning to run off with him? You gonna tell Hannah her mom decided her marriage wasn't exciting enough?" Faith flinched at that, and for a moment, I saw something like shame flicker across her face. "No, I don't know. I wasn't thinking about." "That's the problem, isn't it?" I cut in. "You weren't thinking. Not about me, not about our daughter, not about anything but whatever the hell Lawson was giving you." She sucked in a breath, and I could see the frustration bubbling up now. Good. Let her be mad. It wouldn't change a damn thing. "That's not fair." She shot back, arms dropping to her sides. "You act like I just woke up one day and decided to do this. Do you even know what it's like, Abel? Living with someone who's barely there? You're at the shop from sunup to sundown. You barely talk to me anymore. It's like..." She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. "It's like I'm already gone." I finished for her. She swallowed. I nodded again, slower this time. "And you figured instead of talking to me, instead of telling me you were unhappy, you'd go spread your legs for some sorry bastard who can't even keep his own marriage together?" Her face turned red, and for the first time, I saw anger flash in her eyes. "You don't get to talk to me like that." I pushed off the workbench, stepping closer, lowering my voice. "No? Why not? You had no problem lying to me. To my face. Every damn day." She opened her mouth, then shut it again, breathing hard. I shook my head, looking her over like I was seeing her for the first time. "You know what's funny? I don't even feel sad. Not really. Just disappointed." Her face twisted, like the words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. "Abel." I held up a hand again. "Don't. We're done talking. Go inside. We'll figure out what happens next." For a second, I thought she'd argue. But she just stood there, looking at me like she was waiting for something. An opening. A sign that I'd crack. I didn't. She turned and walked away, and I watched her go, jaw clenched so tight my teeth hurt. Behind me, the hood slammed shut. I turned to see Tom wiping his hands on a rag, eyes meeting mine. "Well, that looked like a hell of a conversation." I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. "Yeah." Tom nodded, tossing the rag onto the workbench. "You gonna fix it?" I thought about that for a second. Thought about Faith. About Lawson. About everything I'd built, and everything I was about to tear down. "No," I said finally. "I'm gonna fix him." Tom gave a low grunt, like he approved. He didn't ask what I meant. Didn't need to. He just grabbed a beer from the cooler near the tool chest, twisted the cap off, and handed it to me. I took a long pull, letting the cold settle in my gut. The weight in my chest hadn't moved, but the next steps were already forming in my head. This wasn't a situation where you just let things play out. That wasn't how the world worked, not in Pine Creek, not anywhere. You got a plan? Tom asked, settling onto a stool near the workbench. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. Yeah. Tom nodded like he expected that answer. He knew me well enough. Lawson's a soft-handed type. Always thought so. Man don't know how to throw a punch, but he sure knows how to talk his way out of things. Not this time. Tom smirked and took a sip of his beer. Guess not. I finished mine and set the bottle down. You ever hear anything about his business? Tom exhaled through his nose. Construction company. Small time. Gets contracts from the county sometimes. Pretty boy reputation. Not a real working man, just a guy who talks like one. I already knew most of it, but hearing Tom confirm it helped. You ever deal with him? Couple years back. He quoted me for some drywall work on my rental. Seemed real interested in cutting corners. I went with someone else. I rolled my tongue over my teeth. That's so? Tom just nodded. A slow grin spread across my face. Good to know. By the time I locked up the shop, Faith was already inside, probably curled up in bed, trying to figure out what the hell she was supposed to do next. I didn't go in right away. Just leaned against the truck, looking up at the stars. Used to be, when I was younger, I'd look up at the sky and feel like I was missing something. Like there was some big, open road waiting, and I was stuck in the wrong place. Prison knocked that out of me. Made me realize the road wasn't going anywhere, but you could still waste your life looking for it. I wasn't missing anything now. Not anymore. Next morning, I got up, got dressed, and made breakfast for Hannah. Faith tried to act normal, like we weren't standing on the edge of something permanent. I didn't make it easy for her. Didn't look at her. Didn't talk to her unless it was necessary. If she wanted to feel like a ghost in her own home, I wasn't going to stop her. Hannah ate her cereal, kicking her feet under the table. Daddy, are we still going to the park later? I nodded, ruffling her hair. Course we are, kiddo. Faith sat across from me, pushing eggs around her plate. I could feel her looking at me. Abel, can we? Not in front of Hannah. Her lips pressed together. She nodded. I drained my coffee, stood up, and grabbed my keys. I'll pick her up after work. Faith didn't say anything. Just watch me go. At the shop, Claire was already there, sorting through invoices. She looked up when I walked in, adjusting her glasses. Morning, boss. Morning. She hesitated, like she could tell something was off. Everything all right? I grabbed a set of keys off the wall. Yeah. She didn't push. Just nodded and went back to work. That was the thing about Claire. She always knew when to speak and when to let things be. An hour later, I was parked outside Lawson's construction office. It was a two-room setup on the bad side of town, the kind of place you kept if you wanted people to think you were a hard-working businessman but didn't actually want to put in the hours. I stepped inside, and the receptionist, a young guy who looked about 5 minutes out of high school, glanced up, immediately nervous. I didn't bother with introductions. Scott here. The kid swallowed. He's in a meeting. I rested my hands on the counter and leaned in slightly. You sure about that? He blinked, glanced toward the back. I think he just finished, actually. Figured. I pushed off the counter and walked past him. Lawson was sitting at his desk, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, startled. Abel. I shut the door behind me. We need to talk. His hand tightened around the phone. Look, I sat down across from him, leaning back like I had all the time in the world. Relax. I ain't gonna break your nose. He exhaled, but his fingers still twitched. I got a proposition for you. His eyes flickered with confusion. What? You're gonna do something for me. And in return, I'm gonna let you walk away from this with your teeth still in your mouth. His throat bobbed. Abel, I cut him off. I know about your little habit of cutting corners. Cheap materials. Half-assed labor. Ain't hard to get people talking. One phone call to the county, and you're looking at inspections that'll sink your whole damn business. His face went pale. You can't. I leaned forward, voice dropping. I can, and I will, unless you do exactly what I tell you. He swallowed hard, shoulders tensing. What do you want? I smiled, slow and cold. First, you're gonna tell Faith you're done. That it was a mistake. That she means nothing to you. His breath hitched. Abel. You do that, or I make sure your wife knows exactly what you've been up to. I'll even send her a little proof. I tapped my phone on the desk. Got more than enough to ruin you. He paled even further. You get one chance, Lawson. One. If I hear you so much as breathe in Faith's direction after today, I'll make sure you regret it. He hesitated, jaw clenching. Then, slowly, he nodded. Good. I stood, adjusting my jacket. And one more thing. His eyes snapped up to mine. You're gonna tell Paige yourself. Today. Lawson's mouth opened, but nothing came out. I patted the desk and walked toward the door. Better get to it. I left him sitting there, looking like he was about to be sick. Outside, I took a deep breath, stretching my shoulders. That was step one. Step two? Making sure Faith knew exactly where she stood. By the time I got back to the shop, I already had a voicemail from Lawson. His voice was shaky, words rushed. Abel, I told her. All right? Faith. I told her it was a mistake. That it didn't mean anything. A deep breath on the other end. I told Paige too. Jesus Christ, Abel, she's leaving me. Taking the kids. What the hell else do you want? I deleted the message without listening to the rest. He wasn't my problem anymore. Inside, Claire glanced up from the counter, her eyes flicking to my face, probably picking up on the shift in my mood. Good news or bad? I grabbed a rag, wiping the grease off my hands. Just news. She waited, but I didn't give her more. Instead, I turned to Tom, who was elbow-deep under the hood of an old Chevy. You free tonight? Tom wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. Depends. What am I getting roped into? Beer. Steak. Maybe a little perspective. He gave me a long look, then nodded. Sounds like my kinda night. Claire let out a quiet breath like she'd been holding it. You sure you're all right? I met her eyes. Yeah, and for the first time in days, I actually meant it. By the time I got home, the sun was dipping low, throwing long orange streaks across the yard. Faith was on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, watching the road like she was waiting for me. I killed the engine, took my time getting out. She looked different. Eyes puffy, mouth set like she'd been chewing over every wrong choice she'd made. You talk to him, she said. Not a question. I walked past her, boots heavy against the wooden steps. I did. Her hands tightened against her arms. You had no right. I stopped, turned. No right? You serious? I let out a low, humorless chuckle. You lied to me. You lied to our daughter. You dragged our whole damn life through the mud for, what? Some middle-aged midlife crisis. She flinched. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You don't get to tell me what I do and don't have a right to, Faith. Not anymore. She swallowed, her gaze dropping to the floorboards. Paige kicked him out. I know. Her head snapped up. Did you? I didn't have to do a damn thing. That was all you two. I shook my head, stepping back. You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about what I did. This is about what you did. Her breath hitched, but I didn't stick around to watch the tears well up. I walked inside, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sat at the table, letting the silence settle around me. She didn't follow. Good. Later that night, Tom showed up, a six-pack in one hand and a bag of takeout in the other. Figured you wouldn't be in the mood to cook. I popped the cap off a bottle, took a swig, then nodded toward the grill. Got steaks in the fridge. He smirked. That's more like it. We stood outside, the hiss of meat on the grill filling the space between us. Tom sipped his beer, eyes on the fire. So, you done? I took a pull from my own bottle, let the question sit for a second. Not yet. He nodded, like that's what he expected. You ever notice, I said, flipping the stakes, how people don't actually regret what they did? Just that they got caught? Tom let out a low chuckle. Been divorced twice. You think I don't know that? I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. She thinks this is about me and her. About whether I'll forgive her. And it ain't. No. It's about making sure she understands what she lost. Tom took a sip, watching me. And Lawson. A slow grin tugged at the corner of my mouth. He's gonna wish he never met me. The next morning, I was up before dawn, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, watching the sky shift from deep blue to pale gray. Faith hadn't come downstairs yet. Good. I wasn't in the mood for another half-assed attempt at conversation. I finished my coffee, grabbed my jacket, and headed out. The shop was quiet when I got there, but Claire had already opened up. She was behind the desk, glasses perched on her nose, flipping through invoices. She looked up when I walked in, taking in the set of my shoulders, the way I carried myself. You're early, she said. So are you. She smirked. Someone's got to keep this place running. I grunted, grabbed a clipboard, and scanned the day's jobs. Tom in yet? She shook her head. Not yet. You expecting him? He'll be here. I set the clipboard down and met her eyes. Need a favor? She raised a brow but didn't hesitate. What kind? Lawson. I want everything there is to know about his business. Who he works with, who he owes money to, anything that looks shaky. Claire's expression didn't change, but I could see the shift in her posture, the way she straightened up just slightly. You want me to dig? If you got time. She watched me for a second, then nodded. I'll see what I can find. I knew she would. Claire wasn't the type to ask a lot of questions, but she was sharp, and she had a habit of knowing things before most people did. I wasn't about to waste that. An hour later, Tom rolled in, rubbing his jaw like he'd woken up with a bad headache. All right, he said, grabbing a coffee from the back. What's the plan? I told him. He listened, eyes narrowing slightly. When I was done, he let out a low whistle. That's cold, man. You got a problem with it? Tom took a long sip of coffee. Nope. We spent the rest of the morning working, but my mind wasn't on the cars. It was on Lawson. I'd given him a chance to walk away, to cut ties and move on, but men like him didn't learn unless you made them. By noon, Claire had a folder waiting for me. She slid it across the desk, tapping one neatly painted nail against the top page. His company's in trouble. Looks like he took on a contract for a new development on the west side, but the work's behind schedule. And from what I can tell, he's running out of money. I flipped through the pages. Invoices, emails, notes she'd scrawled in the margins. Claire was damn good at her job. He in deep. Deep enough. I closed the folder, exhaling through my nose. That's all I needed. Claire hesitated, then leaned in slightly. You sure you want to do this? I met her eyes. Yeah. That night, I made a phone call. It didn't take long to find someone willing to make life a little harder for Lawson. The next morning, I stopped by his construction site. The place was a mess, half-finished framing, supplies scattered around like a tornado had blown through. Lawson was there, standing with his foreman, red-faced and gesturing wildly. His voice carried over the noise. What do you mean they're pulling out? We're on a schedule. I leaned against the hood of my truck and watched. Lawson spun, his eyes landing on me. His face twisted. You son of a... I smirked. Problem? His hands clenched into fists. You think this is funny? A little. I pushed off the truck, walking toward him. Looks like your suppliers aren't too happy with you. Guess they figured out you've been stretching payments a little too thin. He stepped forward, jaw tight. You did this. I tilted my head. Did I? He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. Jesus Christ, Abel. Haven't you done enough? No, I said, my voice even. Not yet. Lawson looked like he wanted to swing at me. I almost wished he would. Instead, he took a step back, running a hand through his hair. Fine, he muttered. You win. Is that what you wanted to hear? I studied him for a moment, then shook my head. I don't care about winning, Lawson. I care about making sure people like you don't walk away without consequences. His shoulders slumped. He looked at me, something close to exhaustion in his eyes. What now? Now. I pulled my keys from my pocket. You get to clean up your own mess. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the wreckage of his own making. 2 weeks passed. Lawson's business was circling the drain, just like I knew it would. Word spread fast in a town like Pine Creek. Suppliers weren't fronting him materials anymore. His workers were grumbling about late paychecks, and Paige had lawyered up, making sure she got her fair share before he lost everything. I didn't need to lift another finger. He was doing the work himself. Faith tried to act normal, like things hadn't changed. She still packed Hannah's lunch, still asked if I'd be home for dinner, still sat across from me at the table, picking at her food. But the space between us was a canyon, and she knew it. One night, after I put Hannah to bed, I walked into the kitchen and found her standing at the sink, staring out the window. She didn't turn when she spoke. How long are we going to live like this? I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. What do you mean? She let out a breath, rubbing her forehead. This, whatever this is. You barely talk to me. You won't even look at me half the time. I didn't answer right away. She turned then, her expression tight. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But do you really think this cold shoulder routine, is any better? I exhaled through my nose. You don't get to ask that. Her jaw tensed. Abel, come on. I'm still here. Yeah. I met her eyes. Why? She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She didn't have an answer. I pushed off the counter. I'm done, Faith. Her breath hitched. You're serious? Yeah. I nodded. I am. She swallowed, blinking fast. And Hannah? She's staying with me. Faith's hands clenched into fists. You think you can just decide that? I gave a short, humorless laugh. I don't have to decide. You already did. I stepped past her, pausing just long enough to say, you made your choices, Faith. Now you get to live with them. She didn't follow me. The next morning, I went to the bank. The house was in my name, and I wasn't interested in keeping ghosts around. I had papers drawn up, told Faith she could take what she wanted, but she wasn't staying. She didn't fight me on it. By the end of the week, she was gone. Tom helped me clear out what was left, stacking boxes in the truck while I stripped down the bedroom, taking apart the old bed frame like I was dismantling the last piece of a life that didn't exist anymore. He didn't say much, just worked beside me, handing me a beer when the job was done. We sat on the porch, watching the sky turn dark. He took a sip, then nudged the bottle toward me. So what's next? I exhaled, stretching my legs out, thinking about expanding the shop. Maybe buying that old bike garage on Route 9. Tom raised a brow. You gonna get back into bikes? Not like before. I rolled the bottle between my palms. Figured I'd fix him up. Maybe start a side business. He nodded, like it made sense. You'd be good at that. I took a drink, let the quiet settle. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying anything I didn't want to. I wasn't looking back. A month later, the old bike shop on Route 9 was mine. The place had been sitting empty for a couple of years, dust thick on the counters, the faint smell of oil and rust still clinging to the walls. It wasn't much to look at, but I didn't need much. Just space. A place to work with my hands, build something that was mine. Tom helped me gut the inside, tearing out the rotted shelving and replacing the busted garage doors. Hannah ran around the shop, her sneakers scuffing against the concrete as she inspected everything with the serious determination only a 6-year-old could pull off. She pointed at an old metal stool in the corner. That's where I'm going to sit when I help. I grinned. That's so. She nodded. Yep. Tom smirked, setting his drill down. Kids got plans. Runs in the family. By the time the place was up and running, I had more business than I expected. Word got around fast. Folks knew I knew my way around bikes, and Pine Creek had its fair share of guys looking to get their Harleys tuned up. The shop felt different from the old auto place. Maybe because it wasn't just about fixing things, it was about building something, about making something last. One afternoon, I was elbow deep in the guts of an old Triumph when Claire showed up. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching me work. You look like you belong here. I wiped my hands on a rag, glancing up. That right? She nodded. Yeah. You seem settled. I considered that. Couldn't argue with it. What brings you by? She hesitated, then pulled a folder from her bag, tapping it against her palm. Your paperwork for the expansion finally went through. Figured I'd drop it off. I took the folder, flipping through the pages. Appreciate it. She shifted her weight, watching me. You know, you never told me why you picked this place. I smirked. Because it was cheap. She rolled her eyes. Come on, Abel. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Because it's mine. Because nobody can take it from me. She held my gaze for a second, then nodded like she understood. Good reason. That night, after closing up, I sat on the front steps of the shop, a beer in one hand, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The past was behind me. The future? Still open. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't running from anything. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The days rolled into weeks, and the shop found its rhythm. I worked with my hands, grease under my nails, the smell of oil and metal in the air. It was honest work, work that didn't need explaining. Bikes came in broken, went out whole. Simple. No lies, no second chances, just fixing what could be fixed and tossing what couldn't. Hannah spent her afternoons in the shop, perched on that same old stool, watching, asking questions. She liked handing me tools, even when I didn't need them, and I let her. She was sharp, curious. Nothing like her mother. Faith had settled in a small apartment across town. I heard things. She was working part-time, trying to pull herself together. I didn't check in, didn't ask. We shared custody, exchanged Hannah without drama. She kept her head down, and I let her. It was over, and she knew it. Lawson. He was done. Lost his business, lost his wife, lost the reputation he'd spent years polishing. Last I heard, he was working a desk job in another county, eating microwave dinners alone. Couldn't have happened to a better guy. Tom stuck around, always had a project or some excuse to drop by, cold beer in hand. He never asked how I was doing, just showed up when it mattered. That was the kind of friend a man needed. Claire, though, she was different. She came by the shop once a week, usually with a stack of papers or some excuse about checking inventory. But we both knew that wasn't why. One night, as she leaned against the counter, watching me wipe down my tools, she smirked. "You know, if you ever needed someone to help with the books, I might know a girl." I looked up, raising a brow. "That's so?" She shrugged. "Just saying." I held her gaze, considering it. Considering her. Then I nodded. "We'll see." That was enough for now. One evening, I found myself on the road, Hannah tucked in the back seat, half asleep. Instead of heading home, I turned onto a highway I hadn't driven in years. It took me 2 hours to get where I was going, an old brick house just outside of Austin. The porch light was on when I pulled up. I stepped out, took a breath. My daughter from my first marriage, Ruby, stood in the doorway, arms crossed. She was 20 now, her mother's eyes but my stubborn set to her jaw. She stared at me for a long moment, then nodded toward the steps. "You drove all this way just to stand there?" I smirked, walking up. "Figured I owed you more than a phone call." She nodded, stepping aside. "Guess you better come in, then." The door closed behind me, and just like that, another door opened. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing for damn sure. I'd built something solid. Something that wouldn't fall apart. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back.